My name is Natalie, and I am 29 years old. This story begins the day my life changed forever. I stood in the hallway of the house I grew up in, my father's house. The walls still held memories of laughter and love, but now they felt cold and empty. My father had passed away just 2 months ago, and nothing was the same. After the funeral, my stepmother, Helen, acted as though she was in mourning, but I could tell something wasn't right. She had always been distant, but now she seemed secretive. Papers were shuffled late at night, whispers were exchanged on phone calls, and she kept me away from anything related to my father's estate. One morning, I woke up to find her sitting at the dining table with a man I didn't recognize. He was much younger than her, probably in his mid-30s. His clothes looked fancy, but something about him felt off. His fake smile didn't match his sharp eyes. Helen introduced him as Victor, a family advisor. I had never heard of him before, but I didn't question it then. I should have. Helen began making decisions without consulting me. She sold my father's car, changed the locks on his office, and even withdrew money from the family accounts. When I asked her why, she brushed me off, saying, "I'm handling everything. You wouldn't understand." It wasn't until I tried to access my inheritance that the truth hit me like a storm. I went to the lawyer's office to review the paperwork for the estate. That's when I learned that the house, the savings, and even my father's shares in his business had all been transferred to someone else, someone I had never heard of before. I was stunned. "There must be a mistake," I told the lawyer. He shook his head solemnly and handed me a copy of the papers. Helen's name was on every document, signing away everything to this mysterious man, Victor. I raced home to confront her. She was lounging on the couch, sipping tea, as if she didn't have a care in the world. "Helen!" I shouted, holding up the papers. "What is this? Why did you transfer everything to Victor's?" She didn't even flinch. "Because I can," she said coldly. "Your father wanted me to take care of things after his death, and that's what I'm doing. This isn't taking care of things. You gave everything away to a stranger." My voice cracked, but she didn't seem to care. "He's not a stranger," she said, smiling slyly. "He's my partner." Her words hit me like a punch in the stomach. "Partner? You mean lover?" My hands were shaking. Helen shrugged. "Call it whatever you want. Victor is going to help me start over. You should be grateful I'm moving on instead of drowning in grief." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. My father had worked his whole life to build a future for me, and she had just handed it all away. "You had no right to do this," I yelled. She smirked. "Actually, I did. You signed the documents, remember? Or were you too blind to read what you were signing?" My stomach dropped. The papers she had me sign weeks ago, she said they were for tax purposes. I had trusted her. I had believed her lies. Now it was all gone. I stormed out of the house, my chest burning with anger and shame. How could I have been so foolish? My father always warned me to be cautious, to trust my instincts, but I had let Helen manipulate me. Now everything was gone. I sat in my car for hours, replaying her words in my head. Victor is my partner. Who was this man, and why had Helen trusted him so much? Something about him felt wrong from the moment I saw him. I decided then and there that I wasn't going to let this go. I needed answers. The next morning, I contacted a private investigator. His name was Thomas Green, a no-nonsense man with years of experience digging up secrets. When I told him about Helen and Victor, he didn't look surprised. "These situations are more common than you think," he said as he jotted down notes. "But don't worry, I'll find out who this Victor really is." A few days later, Thomas called me with his first update. "Natalie, you're not going to like this," he said. "What is it?" I asked, my heart racing. "Victor isn't who he says he is. He's not a family advisor or a businessman. In fact, he's not even wealthy. His real name is Victor Monroe, and he's a known con artist." My stomach dropped. "A con artist?" "Yes. He's been arrested multiple times for fraud, identity theft, and even forging legal documents. He preys on vulnerable people, mostly widows, and convinces them to hand over their money." The pieces started falling into place. Helen hadn't just been fooled. She had willingly handed over my father's fortune to a criminal. Where is he now? I asked. Thomas sighed. That's the tricky part. Victor's been moving around a lot. The last I could track, he emptied a bank account in Helen's name 2 days ago and booked a flight out of the country. He left. I whispered, the weight of his words sinking in. I'm afraid so. He's likely already overseas, making it much harder to recover what he's taken. But I'm not giving up. I'll keep digging. That evening, I returned home and confronted Helen. She was on the phone, probably talking to Victor, when I burst into the living room. She glared at me as I grabbed the phone from her hand. What the hell are you doing? She snapped. Did you know? I demanded, holding up a printout Thomas had given me with Victor's criminal record. Did you know he's a con artist? Did you know he was using you to steal everything? Helen's face turned pale for a moment, but she quickly recovered. That's ridiculous. Victor would never. Stop lying, I yelled, slamming the paper onto the table. He's gone, Helen. He took all the money, sold the property, and left the country. He played you. For the first time, I saw fear in her eyes. She grabbed the paper and scanned it, her hands trembling. No, he wouldn't do this to me. He loves me. Love. I laughed bitterly. He doesn't love you. He used you, just like he's used everyone else. And you let him ruin my life in the process. She collapsed onto the couch, staring blankly at the floor. I didn't know, she muttered. He told me we were building a future together. Your future? I snapped. What about my future? My father's legacy? You gave it all away to a man you barely knew. Over the next few weeks, Thomas and I worked tirelessly to find a way to recover what was stolen. Helen, now completely broken, offered little help. She barely ate or slept, consumed by the realization that Victor had betrayed her. One day, Thomas called with a lead. Victor's name popped up on a financial transaction in Switzerland. It looks like he's trying to launder the money through an offshore account. Can we stop him? I asked desperately. It's complicated, but if we act fast, we might be able to freeze the account and recover some of the funds. You'll need a good lawyer to make it happen. I wasted no time hiring a lawyer and filing a case against Victor. Though the process was slow, I refused to give up. This wasn't just about the money anymore, it was about justice for my father, for everything he worked so hard to build. The courtroom felt colder than I expected. The walls were tall and bare, the air thick with tension. I sat at the plaintiff's table, my lawyer, Mr. Daniels, shuffling through a mountain of paperwork beside me. This wasn't where I thought my life would be 6 months after my father's death, but here I was, fighting to reclaim what was stolen. Helen sat across the room, her face pale and sunken. She had been subpoenaed to testify about her involvement with Victor. Though she initially resisted, she had no choice but to cooperate once the court filed charges against both her and Victor for fraud and misappropriation of assets. My lawyer leaned in and whispered, "We have a strong case. Stay calm and let me handle the arguments." I nodded, my hands clenched into fists beneath the table. It wasn't just about proving Victor's guilt. It was about clearing my father's name and protecting his legacy. When Helen was called to the stand, she looked terrified. As she adjusted her seat, the judge asked her to state her name and relationship to the case. Her voice was shaky, barely audible. "Mrs. Helen Carter," she said. I was married to the plaintiff's father. "Mrs. Carter," my lawyer began, "did you knowingly transfer Mr. Carter's assets to Victor Monroe?" She hesitated, her eyes darting to the floor. I thought I was doing the right thing. Victor said he would help manage the estate. I didn't know he was lying. Lying? Mr. Daniels pressed. "Are you saying you had no idea Victor Monroe had a criminal record or that he was a con artist?" Helen swallowed hard. "No, I didn't know. He told me he was a businessman. He said he could help us start over." "Did Mr. Monroe ever ask you to verify his credentials? Did you ever question why he wanted full control over the assets?" "I trusted him," she snapped, her voice rising. "He said he loved me. I didn't think I needed to question him." The courtroom murmured, and the judge banged her gavel. "Order in the court." Mr. Daniels remained calm. Mrs. Carter, are you aware that your actions not only jeopardized the plaintiff's inheritance, but also facilitated criminal activity? Helen's lips trembled as tears welled up in her eyes. Yes, she whispered. I know I was wrong. As the trial progressed, more details about Victor's schemes came to light. Thomas had gathered overwhelming evidence against him. Bank statements, fake IDs, and even emails where he blatantly discussed his plans to flee the country. One particularly damning piece of evidence was a recording of Victor bragging to an accomplice about how easy it was to manipulate Helen. She practically begged me to take the money. He laughed on the recording. These rich widows are all the same, lonely and desperate. Hearing his voice made my blood boil. I clenched my fists, trying to keep my emotions in check as the judge allowed the recording to play in its entirety. Helen sobbed quietly at the defense table, finally realizing the extent of Victor's betrayal. Despite Victor fleeing the country, the court ruled in my favor. Helen was held partially liable for her role in the fraud, and her remaining assets were frozen. The court also issued an international warrant for Victor's arrest, with Swiss authorities cooperating to seize the funds he had stashed in offshore accounts. We were able to recover $2 million, Mr. Daniels told me after the trial. It's only a fraction of what was lost, but it's a start. The news felt bittersweet. My father's hard work, his legacy, had been reduced to a fraction of its worth. But at least I had something to rebuild with, a small victory in an otherwise devastating battle. As part of the court's ruling, Helen was sentenced to 5 years of probation and community service. She was also ordered to pay restitution, using what little assets she had left. Her once lavish lifestyle was reduced to nothing, and she moved into a small apartment on the outskirts of town. When I saw her after the trial, she looked like a shadow of the woman I once knew. Natalie, she said, her voice trembling. I'm sorry. I didn't mean for any of this to happen. I stared at her for a long moment, emotions swirling inside me. Anger, sadness, and something else I couldn't quite name. Sorry doesn't fix this, I said quietly. You didn't just betray me. You betrayed my father. She looked away, her shoulders sagging under the weight of her guilt. For the first time, I saw her not as the cold, calculating woman who had taken everything from me, but as someone broken by her own choices. For a moment, I felt a flicker of pity. Her apology didn't undo the damage. It never could, but it was enough to remind me that she was human, flawed, and as broken as the rest of us. Months later, I stood in the same empty hallway where it all began. The house had been sold, and I was packing up the last of my belongings. Memories flooded back as I looked around the now bare walls. This house had once been a place of love and laughter. Now it was just a shell of what it used to be. I placed the final box in the car and turned to take one last look at the home I had once loved. It was time to let go, time to move forward. With the money we recovered, I started a foundation in my father's name. It was dedicated to helping victims of fraud and financial abuse, people like me who had been betrayed and left to pick up the pieces. It wasn't the life I had envisioned, but it gave me purpose. My father's legacy would live on, not through the wealth that was stolen, but through the lives I could help rebuild. As I drove away, I felt a sense of peace for the first time in months. The pain and betrayal no longer consumed me. The road ahead was uncertain, and I knew it wouldn't always be easy, but I also knew one thing for sure. I wouldn't let the past define me. I had survived betrayal, loss, and heartbreak. And now, I was ready to write a new chapter, a chapter where I could honor my father's memory, rebuild my life, and reclaim my happiness.